Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Yara Gallegos, and I'm here with my colleague Jackie Thomas from your Northwestern Alumni Association. We will begin shortly, and we're so excited that Susan Corwith could be here with us to present on this great topic. First, we just want to cover a couple of housekeeping items for Zoom. If you have any questions now or during the presentation that you would like to ask Susan, please feel free to use our Ask Your Question box on the left-hand side of your webinar dashboard. Just type in your question, hit send. We'll keep an eye out for those questions and ask a few of them at the end of the presentation today. You'll also find some great resources included in the top tabs of the webinar platform. Please feel free to view that information at your leisure. And should you have any technical issues during the webinar, please refer to the Technical Issues tab to see if your question is listed there. Most issues can be resolved by refreshing your browser. And then lastly, a recording of this webinar and a survey will be sent to all registrants after this talk. Now, I'm so excited to introduce Susan Corwith. Dr. Susan Corwith is the director of Northwestern University's Center for Talent Development and a national leader in talent development research and programming. She brings to this presentation decades of experience helping educators and families understand how strengths unfold over time and how to create opportunities that allow children to thrive in school and beyond. Now I'm going to hand it over to Susan. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you very much, Jared. It's a pleasure to be here and to have this chance to talk with you today. This is a topic that I certainly have a lot of interest in, which is good since we're talking about spotting strengths and interests early. And much of what I'll talk about today are pieces connected to the research that we do here at the center, the things that we bring into our programs, things I've learned about as being an educator and working closely with young children at home as well. So some of the things are going to feel like, that seems pretty straightforward. But it's good reminders, I think, of what's really important as we get to spend time with our children and get to know what really motivates them and excites them. So today's session, we have several different outcomes for today's session. And it's really, first, I want to define for you what talent development means from CTD's research and practice. And I want you to leave with an understanding of how talent is developed, particularly through day-to-day interactions and activities at home. It's really something that can be done through simple conversations and exchanges that we regularly have with the young people in our lives. You'll be presented with a few simple strategies that you can try at home or bring to the forefront at home to support your children's talent development. And this includes ways to sort of encourage curiosity, to provide enriching, open-ended experiences, and to recognize signs of both early strengths and even advanced abilities across different domain areas. And then I'll offer a couple ideas and tools to help you engage in conversations with your child, your children, the children you work with, using some guided questions to uncover interests and strengths, access their motivation, and support their efforts in a thoughtful way. And I'll just save a couple of minutes at the end. I often get asked about CTD's offerings, so just kind of run you through those or direct you to where you can find some additional information. Now, I set up the introduction of myself today kind of in the framework of the things that we'll be talking about. So up here, those are, it's not a picture of me, but it might as well have been me. We're going to be talking about strengths and interests. And so I want my own introduction to reflect a little bit of what I'm trying to do, and then I'll be asking you to do some of your own reflection. My childhood interests, and I have gone back several times just because of the work I do and the conversations we have here at the center about, kind of what stands out about my childhood interests. And immediately I think of reading, and in particular, fantasy and mysteries. I couldn't get my hands on enough of these stories in these genres. And in addition to that, the idea of storytelling, being a storyteller to anyone or everything and everyone that would listen. It might be my stuffed animals, it might be my mother following her around, it might be siblings. But just that idea of that the things I was reading or the things that I came across were also great for telling stories. I really enjoyed and remember many great hours outside climbing trees, bike riding around the neighborhood, playing with the jungle gym in the backyard. I just liked that sort of freeness and some, I hope, what would be relatively safe risk-taking. But interestingly enough, the things I did in the backyard or sort of exploring the yard in the neighborhood and the confidence I felt there didn't always translate into school. I wasn't quite as confident in those spaces or with other people. So that's something I remember. And then the building and tinkering. I fondly remember lots of blocks and things that look like blocks or could be used like blocks, constructing and deconstructing as I got older household items. And I'll come back to this a couple of times, but I fondly remember when I was a little bit older, my father would not describe himself as handy, but he did like to try to take on projects. And the one thing I remember doing was building our gas grill with him, and me following the directions and just sort of building and tinkering and making that work. And the good news is it did work and it was safe. So we're good there. But coming into high school, because talent development is a lifelong process, and so childhood interests often come into what we see in school. And in my high school profile, you would see that my highest grades or sort of my strongest areas were English language arts, and also in science, areas that just really I felt, close to and interested in and pursued, and was lucky enough to be in a learning environment where I was given the opportunity to excel, to advance in those areas and take courses at the time that I was ready for them and that was most interested in them. And then as I think about the college and career pathway, I'm here at the center now. And the work we do is building and directing programs directly for students, but also in working with schools and educators. And I was a classroom teacher for several years, but I enjoyed it, but it wasn't my thing. There was just something about it that wasn't quite the best fit. And instead, I moved into being a reading specialist and a gifted education coordinator and program design. So when I think about sort of the through lines of my interests, certainly English language arts, learning, and then the tinkering and building, I think comes to me now in the way that we design and build programs, and then the way that I interact with others who do that in schools and in external programs and services. And then also when I think about talent development and sort of what I was exposed to and the people who were around me, I had a lot of family in education. So when I looked at my parents, my siblings, my grandparents, 5 out of the 8 of us are somehow related to education, whether that's classroom teaching or whether that's, administration or counseling or something to that effect. So I think you'll see some themes like this as we go along today. And when I talk about talent, it's really defined for us as a natural potential to learn, to grow, to excel in a particular area, like thinking creatively, solving problems, the way we communicate with others. Sometimes it's understanding numbers or using numbers and formulas and things like that, maybe music or movement, athletics, sports, things like that. But it really starts with potential and becomes more focused and domain specific over time. None of us are just sort of born fully accomplished. We have to go through learning processes. We have to be exposed to different areas or subjects. So as young children, we're being introduced to different areas of study, different ways of thinking and learning. So the knowledge and the skills of a domain come with time and with exposure, opportunity to engage. So to create connection with the topic and some empathy for our children or with our children, I want to open the session with some reflection for you. I'm going to give you a couple of questions or a few questions to think about, and if you are willing to do so, comfortable doing so, to drop some of your ideas in the chat. You don't have to answer every question in the chat. I just want to pick up some themes related to the things we'll be talking about. So I just went through my interests and some of the things I remember from my childhood, and I'd really be interested from your point of view. What were you sort of naturally good at or most curious about? Are there things that stand out to you that, gosh, yeah, I just really felt good doing these things, or I felt like I picked them up pretty easily, or I was really interested in them early on? And kind of companion to that, how did the adults in your life respond to those interests? Because that's what we're going to be talking about today. As you see interests or as you expose your child to different things, what are they gravitating to and how are you responding? So how do you remember people responding to your interests? Hopefully many positive things, but sometimes I know maybe when there's sort of like, oh, I'm not familiar with that interest. How do we do that? So Yeah, please go ahead and share some of those things that you remember being really curious about. And then we'll go through this idea of which of those early strengths or areas of curiosity continue into adolescence or adulthood, whether they're formal or informal, because we may have career trajectories. We also have, areas of interest that we follow just for fun, for vocation. But I'm interested. I'm just going to give you a few minutes to think about these things, and I hope share some in the chat. I see one interest in math and sports. That's great to see. What are some of those other things that you were sort of naturally good at, most curious, and how people? I love it. Puzzles, watery sports, needlepoint. Okay, I have to admit, I'm still a puzzler. I'd still like to do a lot of those puzzles myself. Okay, a fellow reader, history, coloring. Yeah. Okay, great. I see a few more things popping in here. Mathematics, imaginary play. Okay. Yep. Writing. Mm-hmm. Yep. And sometimes I see, some we have. Okay, great. Yeah. And sometimes, yes, sometimes parents share similar interests and they're excited to share that with you and they will go out of their way to kind of help do that. Other times, maybe they're just not under, they're busy doing other things. They don't understand what you're working on. That's what, that'll happen too. So it's just a matter of us being thoughtful today and how we might use this. Oh, great. Yep. I love some of these comments. And the things you remember. It's always interesting, some of the things you remember. The counting and numbers, being an accountant. Okay. All right. Yeah. So the messages that we get, we may or may not remember, but some stand out to us. So thank you for doing that. Continue to sort of keep this reflection in mind as we go through some of the activities that I want you to think about with your own children and with the children you work with. Okay. So I just asked you to reflect on your strengths and areas of curiosity, which are sort of your early talents and potential talent areas. And talents, we've learned more and more, are dynamic. They're really not as fixed as we once thought. It was sort of this idea that you had this ability or you didn't. And certainly each of us is different. Our the way where our brains are wired or the exposure that we have is different. However, that said, we can grow these talents. We can develop these abilities with encouragement, practice, opportunities to explore all of these good things. And a child might show early signs of talent in one area, but with our attention, with some of these opportunities, exposure to other people who do these things, they can develop strengths in many areas, in which is, in fact, we send our children to school to learn a whole host of things, but they have a lot of time outside of school as well. And so that's what we're going to be spending a little bit more time on today. So I have another question for you to think about. This time, going to the next few slides are really going to be talking about talent development. So I want you to just take a minute to think about, and then, perhaps put in the chat if you feel inclined to do that. When you hear the phrase talent development, what behaviors or actions come to mind? And this will tie into the things we'll be talking about later in the presentation. So when you hear the phrase talent development, what behaviors or actions come to mind? Just going to give you maybe 30 seconds to think about that and drop a couple of ideas in the chat so I can check for themes. Thank you. I see a few popping into the chat. That's great. Yep, great. Thank you. I see practice, um, training, the idea of persistence and resilience over time. Okay. Yeah. I see some mediated experiences, working with dad or working with another adult, going to courses and camps. Evolution is instead of a set state. Yeah, we're going to be talking about that quite a bit. Exposure to different disciplines, reputation, right? The learning, the mindset, that plan, great. We'll come back to planning. The repetition, yeah, there's a piece of this that's doing things to, in some cases, automaticity because you have to have strong foundational skills in some areas, but also just practice so that you can continue to grow. All right, you all are on it. This is fantastic. Several of these themes are going to come back as we go through what are the things that we should be focusing on and how do we help our children understand these things and use this vocabulary for themselves. Now, talent is not something that we're simply born with. Again, we have certain things that we gravitate to. We have different, abilities but that talent is ability that grows into achievement and creative productivity. So when you're given opportunities to explore ideas, to practice skills, to be challenged at the edge of your competence, you're building those talents, you're building those abilities. And every child has relative strengths, whether they may emerge at different times, they're going to progress at different rates. We just need to respond to those things. But understanding this as a process encourages us as parents, as other caring adults, to stay curious, to ask questions, to introduce and provide new experience for our children, helping them reflect on what really excites and motivates them. And not because everything in life is going to be fun and motivating and everything we ever do is going to fit that, but just to better understand where are some of those strengths and interests that they can utilize to help them even when things are difficult or when they're making choices about what's next, right? And there are several different domains of talent. And what I have on here, these are not like formal research-based, ways of dividing up talents, but it's just helpful sometimes to think about where we might come across some of these things or some of these domains. But there are some more performance-based domains. And we think of students who are young people who are, into athletics or interested in athletics, also, showing a proclivity for that. Music and theater, what I'm calling academic domains. They exist in other places too, but things we might pick up, more directly in school, or in a classroom setting, or in some sort of, institution of learning. So some of our science, history, literature, things like that. But of course, there are a lot of creative and productive domains too. Writing and visual arts, entrepreneurship. You might think about, culinary arts. Creative and productive. Might think of a wide variety of different domains and types of things that we do that fall into these different areas. And again, we can excel in more than one, and we will build these talents and connections over time. All right. Now, the talent development, we know, consists of at least 3 core stages. There's a 4th stage we kind of talk around and about, which is eminence. And these are defined in the talent development mega model that our former director at CTD has done a lot of research with, as have others in the field. But I want to walk through these different stages since they're progressive and kind of highlight a couple of areas of focus and a tip for nurturing talent at each stage, because you're all going to have different young people in your lives at different stages. So in talent development, we all sort of start at the potential stage. And this may happen, of course, as young children, because we haven't been exposed to a lot of things. But we might still be at the potential stage as adolescents or even adults if it's the first time we're being exposed to a particular subject or domain of study or, activity. And we discover our interests and abilities and start building our foundational skills through this exposure and this chance to spend some time in the subject area, where we meet other people who are working in that, where we're led by teachers and mentors. These can be formal and informal. But for our young people at this stage, we want broad exposure to topics, ideas, and activities. Because you don't know what you don't know, right? You don't, if you haven't had a chance to sort of explore and dabble, you don't know what's really out there. So that's an important thing. Playful, exploratory learning. So where children have the chance to make their own choices, to direct their learning. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Sometimes this happens at home. Sometimes this is in clubs or camps. Chances to engage in some hands-on projects with other people, chances for them to collaborate and build foundational skills together. This is, in classrooms, we want our children to work together as well as independently. If they're sharing work project, something that's shared interest, that's really exciting for them. And at the same time, encouraging them to ask questions and try new things and teaching them to kind of regulate their emotions and manage themselves in the environment that they're working in. So as far as a tip here, this is where we're going to talk about noticing and what excites your child and offer more of that. It doesn't always have to be in the same way, but just, things that are connected to those, the activities or the topics that are interesting to them. And if they have a chance to sort of get that exposure, to start practicing in those domains, they're building competence, they're building that foundation. So children or adults who are working in newer domains begin to show consistent strengths and more deep interest in certain areas. So then they're ready for more domain-specific challenges and structures. This is where in school we see some additional enrichment activities. It might be that they need access to more advanced content because they're really learning it quickly and going through it. And so we want that aligned to their skills and their readiness. And that's important at this time too, to be exposing our children to people who work in these different domain areas. What do they do? And those things may change over time. We hear a lot about that when we talk about job markets. But in general, verbal skills, math skills, the areas of interest, how do people think in these fields? What do they do? How do we think like a writer? How do we think like a scientist? What does a historian do? And we can get some of those experiences with mentoring or enrichment activities or programs, some of the things you mentioned in the chat. And as a tip here, this is that connecting stage with mentors and enrichment programs. And I'm not talking about formal internships or having to spend hours, meeting one-on-one with someone, but you have a lot of people in your networks. They do interesting things. Your child may be interested in having a conversation. There's a lot of information you can find on different jobs that people have, but connecting to people who do this work is very helpful. And then ultimately, as sometimes it's adolescence, sometimes it's, college or early career, that we're getting into expertise. Where we are focused, we are highly skilled in one or more areas. We're defining our identity in the work that we're doing or the places we're showing up. And what's really important then, as we continue along the stage, is that if it's high school, it might be advanced coursework. In AP level classes, it might be starting your college major, your apprentice kind of work, your independent study in some cases, the real world applications of internships and practicums and early jobs. It's getting feedback at this point from experts and peers. So the people who are working in those fields are working alongside us, other peers who are in the same areas as we are, and getting opportunities to really contribute meaningfully to that field or to that community. We might spend our life's work or our community work as experts in these different fields. Now, I had mentioned eminence, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but in this talent development mega model at the eminence stage, we're talking about not just being highly skilled and engaging in these domains or in your career, but we're talking about original domain changing contributions, creative productivity and innovation that perhaps completely starts a different type of work or a new discovery that changes the course of what we're thinking. And not everybody's going to become a luminary in the field, but we can still have an impact and we can think about our leadership, how we're sharing the work, influencing others. And so that bigger thought about where does this go? How do we think about this going forward? Okay, let's switch gears a little bit to getting to know our child's strengths, interests, and approaches to learning. There's some simple strategies, and I will repeat that again. They're pretty simple, and sometimes just good reminders of things that you're already doing or that you could do more of. The first thing is what we call noticing or observing. And taking time to notice or observe seems really simple. But it can be more challenging than we expect or than we might think. In fact, as an educator going through my training, we deliberately spend time on how to observe and the ways of collecting data through that observation, right? There's a whole field of study called teacher noticing, and Miriam Sharon is here at the university and has done work in teacher noticing too. So there are formal structures for this, but we're not going to worry too much about that. But we're going to talk about paying careful attention to what's happening without interrupting our children when they're kind of in their flow state. But even teachers have to practice this skill. And so I want to give you some questions or things to think about to help you be an effective observer for talent spotting. Okay. So this first question is, what does your child gravitate toward during free time? What activities spark their attention and enjoy? So watch with curiosity and not with judgment. You may not find what they're doing interesting or exciting. You may, in fact, find it sometimes problematic. But what is it that's giving them joy? What do they pick up when they have time? What do they really love to talk about or to share in some way? To really pay attention to how your child is approaching problems. It's the little day-to-day things that they encounter. And how do they try to address those? So look for strategies and approaches that they're already employing and figuring out how to extend those strategies or help them continue to build those strategies to reflect with you on what's working or what's not. If your child is struggling with approaching problems, then it's a great opportunity to figure out what's sort of detracting from their success in solving these problems or from detracting from them being comfortable or capable of persisting, right? So just observing those times when that's happening and maybe why it's happening. As you're noticing or observing, what patterns do you see in their choices of activities? Look for patterns over time. Is your child persistently building and creating things, telling stories, doing experiments, using materials in different or novel ways? These patterns help you support growth and provide some different choices going forward. You may just notice some things that are kind of surprising to you. And again, they may be things that you also share interest in, or other siblings may enjoy those as well, but they might be completely novel. And it's not always about the things that they're doing that are going well. It's about sometimes the things that are more difficult or even problematic. So then as you're gathering this information, what new experiences and resources can you provide to help them keep going, right? To deepen their knowledge, to get even more engaged in some of these things that they're doing. Okay. And one of the things that you have in your resources is an activity sheet called Spot the Spark. And it's just, some at-home practice questions and things that you can try to develop your noticing and observing skills and start conversations with your children. Now, you're already doing these things, but it's a reminder to make some more time, take some, make deliberate space for some of this. And just checking the chat. Yes, I believe the slides will be available. If not, I can turn them over to Yari so she can share them out. I haven't done that yet, but I can certainly do that if it's helpful. Okay, so this is noticing and observing. Oops. Facilitated play is an activity to do with younger children in particular, although play is great, even into middle school and high school, adults, we should be playing as well. But facilitated play is really an activity to do with younger children. Engaging in facilitated play with your child is both fun, but it's informative too, and it's informative. So it's an approach where you as the parent enrich the activity, but you're not taking control over what's going on. The goal is really deeper thinking, creativity, exploring while keeping your child as the leader, building their self-directed learning, getting to see how they make choices, and letting them build some self-efficacy. And observing what they're doing with those materials can give you some insight into what might be next. In facilitated play, we want you to join as a partner. You're going to ask open-ended questions. You're going to offer additional materials. If they're drawing, maybe they've got a certain set of crayons, but you want to, offer something for them to draw around, an obstacle that they might choose to work around. If they are, digging around outside in the dirt, are there some other things you can give them to use as tools to help them with that? But the thing is to offer those materials as choices, as optional, right? But ways to suggest building on what they're already doing. and encouraging reflection and imagination at the same time. So prompts like, hey, what's happening here? Or what might happen if we added this or if you did this differently can be useful. Again, not telling them they have to do that, but inviting them to engage with you or tell you a little bit more or invite you to participate. Now, if you notice that you're stepping in a little bit more than maybe you might need to, or if your child is deferring to you to make decisions or to solve some challenges that they're running into, then it's time to step back and redirect, right? Because facilitated play isn't about guiding and directing. It's about, or it is about guiding them. It's not about directing or dictating what should happen. So some of these tips here, just to follow our children's lead, they get to choose the activity and the direction as it goes along. Use those open-ended questions and prompts, and there's a handout that I'll share that sort of walks you through some examples of facilitated play and some questions that might be, or how might you think about this, or tell me more about, or how did you decide to do X, Y, or Z? And again, offering those materials and letting your child how to use the materials to go in a different direction or to help with a challenge. And then you offer encouragement, offering alternative approaches if that seems appropriate and different materials to try, but we're not going to fix anything for them. So, look for that facilitated play. And again, you're probably doing this to some extent, but as you're doing that, to kind of pay attention to your own thinking and paying attention to the questions that you're asking your child. Are they open-ended or are they more closed and directed? So. Okay, so not all of you will be, working or having children at home that are at the stage of facilitated play. Although again, I'm going to argue we can play throughout our lifetime. But facilitated goal setting is another step. And facilitated goal setting is an activity we might think about like, later elementary, middle school. You know your child best and kind of when they're ready to have these kinds of conversations. But facilitated goal setting is more about helping you teach your child to reflect on their interests, their strengths, and some goals that they have for expanding their knowledge and skills in different areas, whether that's a school activity or an outside of school activity. But the goal is to encourage, again, reflection and to build their metacognitive skills. Like, do they know how they learn best? Do they, feel comfortable with some of these challenges or how to approach challenges? We want them to be able to set some goals that they can achieve with your support. So we're going to start with observations again about what your children are interested in and what activities they're gravitating to. What subjects they're excelling in. And this, I like facilitated goal setting at transition points. It might be as we're preparing for the summer. It might be as we're preparing for the next school year. It might be as they're starting a new activity, something they're either really excited about or a little hesitant about. It might be when, hey, they come to you with 12 ideas of things that they want to do, and you have the time, energy, and money for two, right? So they're then figuring out, what do I really want to get out of this? And how do I get there, right? How do I do this? So we're going to use a simple planning tool, as I said, sort of at the beginning of a year at a time that seems to make sense. And we're taking time together, at a moment when not everybody's racing and running, where there's time to have a conversation, but to kind of get at what are one or two goals that they want to set for themselves at home, at school, or as part of an activity. It might have to do with their engagement with soccer. It might have to do with them taking an art course after school. It might have to do with a club that they're getting involved in. What do they want to do? What do they want to achieve there? And again, like with the facilitated play, you're going to balance your support with, letting them be the lead and when, stepping in when they need help doing that. Now, there are lots of different goal setting tools and options. The one I'm going to share with you is just called Whoop, and it's online, accessible. It's actually a tool that adults use as well as, children can use it too. But in this Whoop approach, there are these four components. The first is this, what they're terming wish, a meaningful, challenging, feasible wish or goal. So talking with your child a little bit about what that is, a feasible wish or goal. right, is something that has to be teased out. We often think really big, and that's good. But as far as setting and achieving, and doing step by step, we want to break those down or chunk those, and this is great practice. That gets us to this idea of outcome. What's the best result or feeling from accomplishing this wish or goal? Why are we doing this? What's the kind of the end that we're going for? And the end may simply get you to the next step, but we're learning how to identify what we want to accomplish and why. The research is really strongly telling us that addressing obstacles up front is important to success in achieving goals, right? All kinds of different goals. And not just the obstacles we can see in, physically in the world around us, or somebody else's response to what's going on. Those are certainly obstacles. But in this process, we're thinking about what's something inside of you or in your, kind of situation that prevents you from accomplishing your wish or goal. That sometimes has to do with time. This sometimes has to do with energy. This sometimes has to do with, it could be any number of things. But for them to really think about when they haven't been as successful at something or when they haven't achieved a goal, can they identify why? And then we start to plan. Okay, so if I run into that, then I'm going to do this thing. These are my action steps, right? So I'm kind of seeing that I can come up with a way to address that and get around it. Okay. So I see, I'm checking the chat here too before I move on. Even if you have time or money for 10, should you be making them move toward 2? Oh, that's a very good question. Not necessarily. I never like to say your child should be involved in X number of activities. It may be that for a while they are comfortable with, have the time for, you are able to facilitate multiple things happening. There are other times when 1 or 2 is all we can do. Either case is going to be okay, and they're going to be ebbs and flows. And then as they get older, they're probably going to narrow down and need to spend more concentrated time and make some choices. But there's really kind of no great, perfect way to do it. Okay, so we've talked about noticing and observing, facilitated play, facilitated goal setting. One other often overlooked but really powerful approach is collecting artifacts. And this is something that your child can do and probably does naturally, but also things that you can do together for a couple of different purposes. One purpose being to get a picture over time of your child's interests and strengths and talents and how they're developing. And they can also be used later on to inform a conversation with your child's teachers, to make some choices about in-school enrichment, outside of school enrichment, as they get older. This is something that as you practice and you're building portfolios, your child's building a portfolio, it will come in very handy for applying to specialized programs, applying to college, thinking about scholarship opportunities. So let's review some of the different kinds of artifacts or things that you can be thinking about together if you aren't already kind of doing this. But the first thing is sort of those creative outputs and products. Now, back, when I was growing up, it was truly, something up on the refrigerator, like a physical, thing up on the refrigerator, or, in the drawer that my mom had for things that I had created and that we were collecting. But now, taking some photos, putting things in a folder online, there are portfolio tools that are available electronically. But just definite demonstrations of your child's imagination, their kind of growing background knowledge, the way they're using tools, how sophisticatedly are they using materials for their age, the kind of technology that they're exposed to. If they're building huge, Lego communities, or they've taken over your entire living room with building forts, taking pictures of that and talking about what they did there, recording that, is very helpful to better understand their strengths and interests over time. You don't have to keep them forever, but they're useful as you're building different pieces of a portfolio for different purposes. Children can be natural collectors. They have favorite books that they like to collect. They build playlists. They have scrapbooks. They, collect rocks and shells and things like that. So when they have these deep interests, how do we sort of organize them, look through that, decide what to keep, what to purge over time? Does that stay? What does that sort of mean to them? How does it connect to what they might want to study or a course they might want to take? So let's look at those collections and curations and sort of track those. And then when it comes to conversations and questions, you might be gathering some interesting things that your child said or interesting questions that they asked. Those can be helpful when you're talking at school about how, what your child might be needing or how well they're doing. It might just also be interesting to them to tell you more about why they asked that question or why this particular thing was interesting or easy or hard for them. So just to think about how you're collecting those artifacts, how they're using them and collecting them and telling you about them as well. And then finally, we'll get to just some questions that are important. Now, again, we spend a lot of time as educators. I have learned a lot about how to ask questions and the different levels of questions. And still, even with a lot of practice in the classrooms, teachers can struggle with getting beyond basic yes, no knowledge and understanding questions. So it stands to reason we as parents have similar challenges, and sometimes we have to think about the kinds of questions that encourage reflection, critical thinking, sharing. So some questions here that you can use to engage in conversations that encourage attention to talent development. As simple as, what is it that you love to learn about? Or I kind of like the second question when it comes to, the end of the school day and you have some time to interact. What's really the most interesting thing you did or learned about today? You may be surprised with what you hear, for good or for bad, but getting at, kind of what was really cool or what did they identify as learning for that day? Something that they found challenging or hard, but they found worth the effort. This will happen a lot. How many times will they sit for hours in front of their game console and, be defeated, die some horrible death that's happening in the video game, but they'll keep doing it because they feel it's worth the effort, right? So where are those things that they can articulate feeling challenged, but it's really worth the effort for them? When they're working on something, they've made a choice, why did you decide to do it that way? Tell me about that. And going back to some of the questions we had with facilitated play, how did you figure that out? I'm wondering, or I'm curious, what did you like? And then we can also get to what's next, this idea of continuous improvement. So if you could make this even better, what would you add or change? Kind of getting at that, particularly since mindsets in schools, they're going to have to continue to improve things, to do things differently, and they can start to identify that for themselves. Okay, a few more activities for you and your child at home before we kind of wrap up for today. The first thing is, again, pretty simple, but an important reminder that free play with household materials is really excellent for creativity and innovation. And again, discovery of kind of unique interests and strengths that you might not see otherwise. The materials never have to be expensive. They certainly can be, toys, games, technology, but things like boxes and paper and sand and water and things like that are great for explorations in texture, imagination, how things work or don't work. And then rotating these materials periodically gives children a chance to find new favorites. We've done this with, with a lot of the children in my life, just, changing up what they have access to on a regular basis, which is kind of exciting to go in and like, oh, this is new, this is different. My mother, who was a kindergarten teacher, was wonderful about this, sort of bringing some things home, saying, what can you do with these things I just put in front of you? Art supplies and clay and paint and crayons and, how do you, I remember many hours of smushing Play-Doh against different parts of our house to see the texture and the print that was there. But just sort of that exploration, as simple as it is, when you have the conversation about why or what that means or how that works, is pretty useful. So again, seems pretty simplistic, but in today's world where we're focused on technology and sort of structured games and toys, this free play with materials is important, especially if we can kind of facilitate that. Okay, and then these everyday or common at-home activities to also give you a chance to listen for your child's interests in how they approach these tasks and what questions they ask or what they're willing to engage with you on or not. Everything from, a family book read or, a family game night to helping with cooking. Some students really, they love that for the creativity. They love it for the science. They love it for the mathematics. The involvement in family budgeting, and I'm not saying we all sit down and we figure out what we're, spending on housing and electricity and all that good stuff, but how are they budgeting their time? What are the things that they're going to do or some of the activities that you're engaging in together that they can sort of think about how they're going to use some of their resources, right? When it's planning for a family trip, what choices do they get to make or how do they help with that? Caring for a pet is another way of getting at sort of what are they really good at or interested in? When are they struggling? And how do we help mediate that? This is often where obstacles come into play with caring for a pet. Or help fixing household items. Like many of you in the earlier reflection, you were talking about some of the activities that you really enjoyed or that you did. And I mentioned, fixing or putting together the grill with my dad. These are engineering, these are creativity, these are getting at, do my children really like those hands-on constructions? Do they really like reflection, storytelling, writing? And how do we sort of move that into something else? Okay, so the last sort of activity is about informational interviews or job shadowing. So thinking about the people that you know, the people in your networks that are close to you, you can certainly consider what they do and which jobs or vocations or activities might be new to your child. At CTD, we used to spend more time. We haven't had as much time to do this recently. Just interview a variety of interview people in a variety of different kind of jobs or things that they enjoy doing or that they've become very accomplished in, and tracking back their sort of pathway to getting there. You can also use biographies and documentaries. There's so many of these things now accessible on YouTube or other platforms. Even exploring university websites for majors and course requirements. My husband, who was an art teacher for many years, would often introduce, hey, this is an interesting art school you might consider. Go check out their website, see what kind of majors are there, what jobs are connected to those. And they would spend a lot of time just exploring that and being amazed that there was more to it than, you know, studio art was certainly a way they could go, but there were plenty of other things that they might not have thought of. But we learned that through volunteering at community organizations and at local businesses as well. So, and of course, you can always get into formal programs at museums, libraries, through our education and community organizations. I'm sure you're familiar with most of these things here. I just want to make sure I have time for questions. So maybe I will hold on the CTD programs piece and just come back to that a little bit. But Yara, did you want to go to questions at this point?
Yeah, sure. No, thank you so much for all of this, Susan. Let me go ahead and share some of our questions that came in. In the chat, we have a question. For older children in middle and high school, how do we continue to support breadth of exploration in their current environment when children's specialized interests in sports so early compared to decades ago? Do you see this leading to early burnout or inability or lack of ability to pivot and find new talents?
There is lots of different research going on related to these questions. And I think, in fact, there was just some that was talking about, if students who perform or are high achievers early on in some areas, they don't necessarily continue that. But there's other research that says, in fact, that trajectory does stay there. But I think when we talk about from a talent development point of view and perspective, is that ongoing communication with your child. How is your child responding to these things? What is their level of energy? What is their ability to sort of attend to different things? If they really are passionate about something and they want to spend their time doing it, it's not necessarily a problem, because within that, like within that sport or within that, musical, with that musical instrument, there's, what they do with that. There are, orchestras and other ways of, so I'm just saying within a domain, there may be lots of different choices. So their specialty may be there, but there's still other, like, what are all the jobs connected to this? What are the other ways that we can engage in this? So I guess what I'm saying here is that take the cues from your child. Sometimes that early specialization is what's needed, is what's wanted, and it's okay. that will continue. But do make sure, and I think this is an important part of the question, about you being there to introduce different options and at times saying, I'd really like you to pursue this too. Give it a try, and then we'll come back to make a decision if you're going to continue that later or not. So if your child has a lot of different interests, that can be. I'm going to also come back to some research that we just did on our super users, kids who've been involved in our programs for multiple years. We saw two very distinct lines of patterns. Kids who did specialize early and stay there and enjoyed it, and as adults, you know, were were fully engaged in that. Might be they did become a scientist, they did, move into business, something like that. Where there were other kids who truly jumped from idea to idea, subject to subject, and it didn't, by the time they got to high school and college, they had found something that they really wanted to focus on at that point. Bottom line, it's really not. It's all in how it's kind of mediated and handled.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And we have another question here. What tips do you have for increasing a child's self-esteem, especially for children with special needs who may have an interest in something but not an aptitude?
Hmm. That's a really interesting question. Thank you for that. I think the one thing I think that or one thing that we talk with our families a lot about, and with the educators when they're working with the students that we have in programs, is continuing to reinforce this mindset of trying, getting out of it what we're enjoying, seeing the progress we're making. Yes, acknowledging that we get frustrated when things don't always work. And then finding the spaces where, particularly if you're talking about a child, who has special needs, or, finding the environment where they can do the thing that they're really interested in and love, and other people are supportive of that. It may not, be that they're, if it's a competitive area, they may not be in the highest level of competition, but still getting that chance to be doing that and to encourage, even when it's difficult. If they're enjoying it, we can find spaces to continue to support that and to get people to scaffold and help with that. So I think the self-esteem we're finding really does come from focusing the mindset on, gosh, what are you really enjoying about this? What's really going well? How can you look at this and see what's different, or how you've grown since we started? It's not when we focus on the award, the final outcome. That's where they start to struggle with, gosh, I didn't get to that, and now I feel like I shouldn't do this again.
Yeah, no, thank you. And then similar to this line of continuing this communication with children and the young ones in our lives, and with reframing, if we can go back to our high schooler question, what if the high schooler in our life does not respond well, or is resistant to opportunities you offer to expand their breadth and depth of interest? They just might not realize the importance of it yet.
And that's the key right there, yet. To keep trying and to figure out, your child best, about when you really can push, and when you need to give them a little bit more time or space. And then to come back to the idea of the goal setting, or to be able to say, hey, I really do want you to try this thing right now. And you can do that, it doesn't always, this gets to motivation, intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. And you can use some of those external motivators at times to get the ball rolling. And to go back to that goal setting about, if there's a particular obstacle that seems to be there, how we might address that. Is there a certain point where there'll be another decision where you don't have to continue with that? They have an out if they need it, but not immediately. They have to do something first. They have to try something, get so far before they, change course. Those steps can be helpful. But truly, if they're so resistant, it's not always worth fighting it at that moment, depending on what the situation is, of course. But
Yeah. And then we have two questions next related to children's interests. The first one is regarding cues, how to decide when a young child around late elementary is really interested in an activity. So, for example, what this attendee shared was they enjoy playing an instrument with a teacher, but they hate practicing it at home.
Yeah, that's a pretty common issue that we run into because they just want to do the fun thing or they want to get to the part where they can, choose and be free with it. But if they're going to be able to build their skills, be good at it, they are going to have to practice. And the more they build those skills and it becomes autonomous or automatic, the easier it is to do these other things. So this is where I was talking about the motivations and intrinsic and extrinsic motivators, right? To be able to, it's okay to say to your child, you really do need to practice for this amount of time. And then as a result, you can have extra, playtime or whatever it is that might be the motivator for them. But the importance of, them doing that practice, and sometimes it isn't going to be fun. Not everything all the time is fun and entertaining. But if we do find it more broadly interesting and something we want to do, then we have to spend a little bit of that time up front to get to that. So, but early on when they're really young, they're not necessarily going to understand all of that, but it's breaking those steps down, using some of those motivators, limiting the amount of time that they have to do that thing that they really don't like to do, so that they can get to where they want to be.
Yeah, and then with a similar line of this, when you add the layer of the social environments that children are in, one attendee shared, I have 4 children from ages 2 to 8. How can we know that an interest is truly theirs and they're not simply mimicking what another sibling is doing or drawn towards? They share that observing each child individually becomes difficult when they're always together and doing the same things.
Yeah, yeah. And when they are together, I think that's the observing part when they're all together is still fine because are they truly doing all the same thing, even though they're doing the same activity? Or are they sort of taking it in different directions? Is, one child deferring to another? Or just interesting in the interactions, or the choices that they're making when they're all doing that activity. And then it can be really hard. I get so many hours in the day and children doing lots of different things, going lots of different directions. But when you can carve out a little bit of time to just interact with one of the children and really, give them a choice of what they're working on, you might see something different. But I think if they are, you know, they're only going to mimic for so long. And after a while, they're either going to get bored with that or, a sibling's going to tell them to go do something else, and to take advantage of kind of that time and to kind of see what happens. And I think we see that sometimes siblings, they do sort of have shared interests. They are kind of along the same path. They influence each other, and that's okay. And as they get older, they'll either continue that because it drives they're passionate about it, or they might find something else at that point, and that's okay. So there's no like time when it's, they've lost their chance, right? They're not going to lose their chance to explore something later on if we're paying attention to that.
Yeah, and then looks like we have time for one more question because I would love to allow space to share some of CTD's offerings
Sure.
with our attendees. So for our last question, how can you help your child improve their reframing or work on their reframing skills when they are a high achiever who feels like a loser, or they're not achieving if they don't
Mhm.
win, and there's
Mhm.
always an element of comparison with other high achieving children or their peers?
Yeah, that's a hard one, and it happens a lot. I would say, probably not right in that moment when it's most overwhelming and feeling most strong. We want to acknowledge their feelings then, but then to come back to the conversations about learning and what the growth that they're making, sharing your own experience, pointing out when you're, not doing something maybe in the way that you even wanted it to go. But for them to keep seeing those experiences and having a chance to ask, to share their thinking about it, getting at those questions of like, well, what would happen, or what's really kind of the bad thing that's happened here? Because if they can articulate that, you can help them work back from that and sort of say, but really it's about this learning, this experience, this, next step that you've made. But it takes time. And the thing with that is to kind of keep giving those examples, keep giving that, focus on the growth and what they are learning and what they're doing differently and the importance of everybody learning and everybody having difficulties. But if it's just persisting and it's really dragging them down, then that is the kind of time where you think, okay, maybe some other intervention and help with that because there might be a little bit more going on to explore. But it's a common thing for initially for really high achievers to feel like they have to, especially when things might have started out happening really easily for them. And then they start to figure out that not everything is easy, and they haven't figured out that that's a normal, regular, ongoing thing. So it's the timing of that.
Yeah, thank
Okay.
you, Susan. And then would you like to share some of the center's offerings that might be of interest to our guests here?
Sure, I can do just a really quick overview for anybody who's interested. But one piece of what we do is when we think about interests and strengths, especially school-related ones, assessment is one tool. We do above grade, below assessment, and we have for a long time to help better understand. If you think your child sort of reached a place where they may need more enrichment and more advanced learning, assessment can be of help. But what people most often are interested in are the fact that we have summer in-person programs, grades 6 through 12 here on this campus, 1 and 3 week programs over the summer. So those are currently enrolling across a wide variety of subject areas, as well as a special strand that's specific to leadership and service learning or community development. So you can certainly check those out on our website. We have year-round online programs, both for enrichment, and there's an online family program that's 4 weeks. That's really about all of the things we talked about today, practicing together, spending time with your child around things that seem to be of interest to them. But there are online programs for enrichment, for honors and AP. So if students need access to advanced and accelerated classes, we have those as well over the summer and then throughout the school year. And then throughout the school year, fall, winter, spring, there are weekend enrichment programs. The spring program will be here on this campus starting April 11th. 6 weeks of half-day courses, just a chance to dabble and try subjects that seem to be standing out to them, along with other kids who have similar interests and taught by an instructor who shares those interests as well. And this summer, we wanted to point out that our K through 5 1 week enrichment programs will take place here in Evanston at St. Athanasius, but our new summer site is at South Loop Middle School. So several 1 week sessions for enrichment taking place this summer in Chicago and in Evanston. So I will stop there.
Thank you so much, Susan, for sharing CT's open resources as well as all the great knowledge that you shared with us today. And thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today, as well as for participating in the chat and sharing your experiences with us. This webinar is part of a 3-part series hosted in partnership with the Center for Talent Development. And in this evidence-based series, experts from CTD share how talent develops over time and how parents and caregivers can actively support that development in children under 18. We encourage you all to register for upcoming presentations. We'll go ahead and throw those in the chat. And then to find more alumni events, please check the NAA website at alumni.northwestern.edu. Thank you everyone so much for joining us, and go Cats!